Thank you for the invitation. I'm actually not necessarily speaking on behalf of anybody but myself. I'm a former diplomat, so I'm not on behalf of the government. And even though I run the Danish Cultural Institute, this is kind of a personal testimony based on a lifelong experience in business, culture, and diplomacy. I took this challenge because I am quite often sickened a little bit by the tendency of both national politicians and nations to try to sell their own models as something with such a pioneering status that the whole world should just copy it. So it's pretty challenging to try to be here today and try to find out if there actually is something to be proud of, something that we can use in relationships with other peoples and other states. Is there really a Nordic experience? Maybe one should also consider introducing new concepts, not just soft power, but also maybe talk about soft diplomacy. I should have listened to the morning speakers before I actually thought about what I was going to say, but I'll try to modify a bit as I go along and comment on what happened. In my mind, the world starts and human experience starts with culture, not with diplomacy. Diplomacy can be a very useful tool that can be used in intercultural relations, also in intergovernmental relations, interhuman relations. But my starting point, like the Minister of Culture, I agree fully with her, it kind of starts out with culture. I studied cultural anthropology when I was young and moved into political science when I realized that the salaries in the Danish diplomatic service were much better than the salaries you could get in working in a Danish museum. But anyhow, I think we should consider the concepts of power, of soft power a little bit, and maybe look into finding another term, maybe something we could call soft diplomacy. Power, even in the soft version, the Joseph S. Nye version, has something to do with wanting to persuade somebody to do something. It has nothing to do with a goal, it is a working method. What Joseph Nye actually says is that soft power has the ability to attract and co-opt rather than coerce as a means of persuasion, implying they will end up doing what we want them to do. My point is, and my experience tells me, that if we really want sustainable solutions, we have to start using more soft diplomacy, not soft power. The diplomatic version implying that we, in cooperation, end up creating value for all involved in the process of dialogue. Now, for those of you who still have your minds set for listening, do it now. I'm going to take my conclusions up front while you still remember. Then you can doze off until the end, where I will give you the secrets, the Nordic code of behavior that you should note down carefully. I'll give you the conclusions first. Yes, there has been developed a Nordic experience, a Nordic profile, and a Nordic methodology. It has taken some time. I will go through the history later on, from the 60s, from the relatively simplistic approach, also expressed today by the distinguished speaker of Danish Parliament, the belief that our Nordic welfare model could be used in almost a universal shape. The second conclusion, yes, soft power works. It does, but only if it's translated right by soft diplomacy, emphasizing not persuasion, but mutual understanding. That is hard, but it works, and I'll give you my guidelines later on. Third, no, neither soft power nor soft diplomacy is always the right or the appropriate answer to major international challenges. Sometimes shit happens, and then other methods have to be used, and sometimes hard power is necessary as one of those methods. We're not naive. And fourth, yes, the more complex the relationships are, and the more complex the issues develop, both state to state, state to non-state, or between many different mixtures of various doses of both, the more complex the doctor's prescriptions of both soft and smart diplomacy have to be. Now that's the 4 conclusions. Now I'll give you a little bit the history. How did the Nordic experience develop? How did we get to where we are today? In the 50s, 60s, 70s, and maybe up until the early 80s, the global context we played in was the post-war era, the post-Marshall Aid era, the European integration processes, decolonization, Cold War, Vietnam, Milton Friedman, Ronald Reagan, and even Margaret Thatcher. That was the context. The global trends in coping with interstate and inter-people relations in some kind of cultured method, some kind of soft power development in the embryonic shape, was probably the beginning of the ODA, the Overseas Development Assistance, established over those years by most of the OECD nations. The Nordic profile in this period was characterized by pretty large bilateral development programs, and most of these were, I put it bluntly, designed to promote our own Nordic and social democratic values of ideology and solidarity. Soft power, cultural diplomacy in modern terms, was hardly ever thought of and even less used, maybe apart from a very few civic and NGO mobilization projects. We were in the Nordics in those years so sure of our own shining example that we simply had to export it. Of course, it was obvious that it was good for us, it had to be good for the rest of the world, so why not just promote it and live happily ever after, almost as happily as the happiest nations in the world, like Denmark. We gradually found out that the world was not as Nordic as we thought and did not share our background nor our values. In the 80s, the 90s, the global context changed. We moved into the post-colonial period, the post-Cold War period. Poland and Solidarność spearheaded a development of democratization. The roundtable process in Poland was led by a process of highly intelligent internal soft power diplomacy, a process and a method that opened a new era, not just for Poland, but also for many of the new nations in old Eastern Europe. The global trend was, in a way, at the global level, expressed by the UN Commission for Culture and Development, and creative diversity began to be seen as an asset. Accordingly to that, we changed a little bit our Nordic profile from the simple export of the welfare state to involve culture. Media became part of Nordic ODAs, and we saw the clear beginning of human right-based development projects. Especially Sweden was ahead of the pack, followed by Denmark to establish a more and larger ODA on culture and media. The Nordic profile in the Baltic region and in Russia was developed along those lines. Come on in. From the turn of the century and onwards, the global context as we see it today is globalization, sustainability, and the explosion of new communication technologies. Past the great divide of 9/11, we got to know new global players, non-state actors, and dramatic changes. The global trends in this new landscape in terms of multilateral and international cooperation and culture is probably best expressed by 3 phenomena. The Millennium Development Goals agreed by the Millennium Summit in New York in 2000, defining the 8 development goals to be achieved by 2015. The 2005 UNESCO Convention on Cultural Diversity, and the strengthening of the focus on cooperation based on universal human rights framework. In the terms of impact on our Nordic profile, we reacted to those challenges, expanded our cooperation with the Arab and Islamic world to strengthen our relations and strengthened our relations with the BRICS. At the same time, we added focus on some of the Millennium Goals, especially the goals of gender, sustainability, and partnership. Soft power, cultural diplomacy, and sometimes even smart diplomacy was given a more important role. unfortunately often in parallel to a use of real hard power, especially in the Middle East. Now, I'll try to link these historic developments to field experience. And if we start out with the 70s and the 80s, I spent most of those years in the Arab world, in Egypt, in Algeria, most of the time in Algeria. There was not one living sign of any kind of cultural diplomacy in North Africa in those years, my ladies and gentlemen, none whatsoever. A little bit Swedish, because the old Ambassador Edelstam, some of you may remember Ambassador Edelstam, a fantastic Swedish diplomat. He still lived and he fought strong for humanitarian and civilized behavior between people and states from his embassy in Algeria, but he was pretty much forgotten in the rest of the world. On the other hand, Algeria was interesting in those years because you got the experience of a cultural diplomatic soft power approach, which was extremely visible. I spent quite a lot of time visiting the mosques. I loved it. It was a peaceful and friendly place to be. And the development of the mosques and the culture around the mosques was not necessarily driven by high public investment or cultural policy developed by the Algerian government, but was driven by friendly Arab brothers who invested in bringing back Algeria to well, something that was at least different than the 130 years when they had been under a terrible oppression by the French. So with powerful and strategic funding from Arab brothers, Algeria moved back to the Arab world and back to Islam. And we saw that in 1991 when the FIS, the Islamic Salvation Front, won the elections. What followed in 91 in Algeria was a rerun of what we see in Egypt today is a rerun of what we saw in Algeria back in 91. The 80s and the 90s, I saw that the world passing by in a mix of business and diplomacy. The Baltic region and Russia was the main focus. I was part of the management running the airline SAS over those years and played a role in something which you could call soft business diplomacy. We opened direct flights into the Soviet Union before the Soviet Union was disinvented or disintegrated. We opened flights in '89 to Riga. I was there opening it. We were actually there before the Cultural Institute was established. That was established back in 1990, 25 years this year. No, next year. Yeah, next year. Where's Bertel Haarder? He's not here yet. Well, Bertel signed was the official ribbon cutter for the Danish Cultural Institute in 1990. A fantastic breakthrough, and an institute which, together with the Nordic embassies, played a fantastic role in trying to develop the civil society of the Baltic states. We all, the Nordics, went into the Baltics really big time, with all the tools available, from the best cases in the official development assistance toolbox. We used both soft and hard, both cultural and smart diplomacy in basically all spheres of life, operating on a very broad concept of what culture is. It's not just dancing ballet or singing songs, but it has to do with the building of a civil society. We had a powerful and strong political commitment. I remember the instructions I got from my then chief, the foreign minister, Niels Helveg Petersen. He said, just go and do whatever is necessary to make our Baltic friends well-functioning societies that we can welcome in the European family of nations. We set in motion so many different things, from getting a free press up and running, getting a civil society development set up by doing NGO advisory services. We built networks in almost all spheres of life, between governmental agencies and non-governmental agencies, between people and people, artists and artists, educators and educators, scientists and scientists, the whole lot of it. It was from the beginning totally uncoordinated. It was a mess. Lars is sitting here, he was part of it also. And it was a terrible mess. Everybody was so eager to help that we sometimes had much too much to handle. And those that we wanted to help got so many different pieces of advice that the confusion was sometimes tremendous. And apart from all the crazy advice they got from us, they had enough to to fight with because of an economy that had collapsed completely. I'm not going to bother you too much with details, but some of the learning points of those years are probably worth sharing. I mean, in order to use cultural diplomacy for soft diplomatic purposes, and maybe even also something like if you want to be really tough and you want to push people for soft power purposes, at least you have to start with a couple of very basic points. You need to have a very strong popular and political support from all partners in the process. Without that, nothing works. You have to have strong commitment from all the field players. You have to have economic and human resources that reflect the political commitments. Sometimes these days it's much easier to get a political commitment than to get the resources and the human resources to live up to those commitments. It is also very important to have an extremely close and seamless communication between the headquarters and the field. You have to have a flexible administrative approach based on trust and on willingness to take risk, otherwise you can't do the change necessary. You have to be able to listen and to learn when you work in the field. You have to be able to improve quality as you go along. And then you have to be able to specialize and divide with partners. Over the years I spent in Riga as Danish ambassador, we developed a very strong sense of working together between the Nordics. We shared experience, we borrowed expertise from each other, we helped each other to be proactive and extremely honest, also sharing bad experience, both with bad partners and bad projects. And I think we shared also a feeling of having a historic mission that simply had to be a success. At the same time, we started out we started out with the most important precondition for success, the full support, both popular and political. As for Denmark, we could have done things much better, especially in the beginning. It was a nuisance that too many resources were earmarked to Danish advisors and consultants. We sometimes felt really bad about it because it was embarrassing and showed a lack of trust to our Baltic partners. Sometimes our efforts could have been both more soft and more diplomatic. But it worked. All three states came out functioning well, caught up, became members, and we will live happily ever after. The start of the 21st century, I'm getting close to the conclusion now, allowed me to get a little bit of field experience in Poland. I think I can say that in those years we experienced one of the most intensive uses of soft power in post-European history, the enlargement of NATO and the European Union. The soft power used on a full scale in these processes were in a way more specialized version than the more ODI-like methods we used in the Baltics in the 80s and the 90s. In the field, we never thought about these things in sophisticated terms of soft power or cultural diplomacy. We just did it. Right now, up towards the deadline of the Millennium Development Goals, 2015, soft power, cultural diplomacy, soft diplomacy in a regional setting is again uniting the Nordics, the Nordic Council of Ministers, Baltics, Germany, Poland, and the EU. Culture for sustainable development is the focus of a new, huge cooperation project. A new flagship that we are developing in the Baltic Sea region, a ship built on a platform of creativity and culture, built on knowledge of culture and creativity as drivers for sustainable development, and built with the explicit purpose of coming up with high quality and high impact specific proposals on culture for sustainable development in the Baltic Sea region. Not to big surprise, the ship we are developing is called Culturability Baltic Sea region. It is loaded with a number of ideas, practices, recommendations, and projects for culture and sustainability. The ship and its cargo has been developed in a process of dialogue, workshops this year in Rendsburg, Gdansk, Riga, and will be concluding the 1st and 2nd of October this year in Copenhagen, its first phase. The Danish Cultural Institute in Riga has had the pleasure of being in charge of the shipyard, and we look forward to welcome as many of you as possible to when we present our presentations on the program, on our proposals and our partners very soon in Copenhagen. Just at the end of it, I'll give you 5 little words that define our long and hard road through 50 years of work to success in developing a special Nordic code of behavior. It reflects some of the advice we got from the morning speakers. In my world, it starts out by the ability to listen. So listen. When you have listened, then ask questions, discuss and debate. When that is over, share. Find out where you have common ground, where you don't have. Find out what you want to do, set goals, but share. So listen, discuss, share, and then be inclusive. Love your neighbor. Talk to your enemies. And then at the end of the day, you'll end up doing what should be the purpose of all this human activity, co-create. Go and do it. Thank you.